All right. So today's topic is we're going to combine PHPUnit with Selenium with Laravel. So what specifically I'm going to cover is the regression testing aspect of this. So let's first actually talk about what these things are. So PHPUnit is just like framework for PHP running unit tests. So we kind of briefly talked about it before, especially you, but have you guys done any type of testing, specifically unit testing? Are you familiar with any of these concepts? Have you worked with Selenium, anything like that, just to get a base of? So we worked with Selenium. What about you?
I've worked with PHPUnit. Selenium out of the browser wasn't. We wanted to get automated testing running through PHPUnit and like Mockery.
Mm-hmm.
And my biggest problem that I ran into wasn't PHPUnit itself, but actually Mockery and mocking queries and different things like that.
Yeah.
We ran that challenge where I still have yet to solve it. It was one of those projects where we actually took a full week or two and like cleared my schedule for that. And at the end of 2 weeks, I still didn't have it solved, so I was pretty upset. But it just paid me.
All right. Well, let's first talk about regression testing. So what is regression testing? So basically, it's a lot like any type of testing. You want to make sure that when you refactor your app, nothing breaks. So if you're worrying about any major code change in your code base will break things, don't worry, we got your back. That's what we're going to talk about today. So basically, what we're going to talk about is running tests you can run continuously over and over and over again. So every time we do any type of change in code base, we can make sure that things are still working. Specifically today, we're going to talk about how to make things anticipate the front end of things, front end of the website. So we talked briefly about PHPUnit, but I just want to go a little bit deeper. This is a typical unit test of PHPUnit. So what you usually test is like business logic or something very specific. The whole idea behind a unit test is you test the smallest parts of your code. So in this case, we have a coordinate class, a line class, and we basically test that given these this line, these coordinates, and this coordinate, like what is this between them, and make sure that the result returned is correct. So what you'll notice immediately is the whole point, the whole thing that's like the core of PHPUnit is all these assert functions. That's assert equals, assert contains, assert not null, assert null, all kinds of things. And everything is split into test cases, and each test case has these individual functions. So this is one function of test case, and you can have as many as you want. So the next thing we're going to talk about is Selenium. So what Selenium is this piece of software that can interact with browsers. So essentially, it allows you to automate actions in the browser. This example I'm going to show today is using Chrome, Google Chrome, but one of the built-in browsers that Selenium has support for is like Firefox, for example, and you can also use it with a lot of different other browsers. So it's kind of like a framework that plugs into any browser you want, basically. So the way it works is Selenium ships with support for a couple of browsers, like for example Firefox. The browsers that doesn't have built-in support, you need something called a WebDriver. So I have a Chrome WebDriver, for example. And Selenium just hooks into the browser, and most of the stuff that Selenium does is through JavaScript. And then it exposes this thing called the JSON wire protocol, and it's basically a simple REST API to your browser, which is kind of cool, thinking about how you can like make GET requests to your browser to like get execute, open a website, or like find an element and stuff like that. The cool thing about Selenium is it has clients for all kinds of libraries. Of course, we're going to focus on PHP today, but it also works with Ruby, Java, C#, if all those Python, whatever. It works for all of them because it's just a REST API. In order to get started with this, we're going to need a few components. So I'm kind of like basing this off of like a simple Laravel app, but you can use this with any PHP project basically. The easiest way to set this up is using Composer dependency management. So what do you want to make sure you have? You want to make sure you have PHPUnit installed, set up, running. You need your PHPUnit XML file and like your folder structure and all this default PHPUnit stuff. The other thing you need is actual Selenium, which is just a Java app. And in this case, since we're using the Chrome WebDriver, I'm going to download the Chrome WebDriver and set that up as well. And the last thing you need is to make sure that you have all the dependencies set up. So of course your dependency is PHPUnit, but also the PHPUnit Selenium library. So we're actually going to use some functionality that's built right into PHPUnit. Hey, welcome. Good to see you. So one of the questions that you might have right now is, okay, why would I fire up a full-blown browser to test things in the front end when I can just make simple HTTP requests and like basically scrape HTML and stuff like that? Laravel actually has built-in support for doing that. Why would I like have that way in a browser? And I'm going to show an example a little bit later in a demo of a situation where you can't really scrape your way out of it in a good way that's very testable. And of course, another thing you can do is you can test that your site functionally works across multiple platforms and multiple browsers. So I'll go through this a little bit further at the end as well, looking at some different options we can do. So first, let's talk about how to remote control your browser through PHPUnit. So this is literally like controlling an RC helicopter or something like that. You tell your browser to do stuff using commands. So here's a few examples. So first of all, this is a way of finding elements. This whole behavior we are working with right now is a lot like how jQuery works with like CSS selectors and stuff like that. So first of all, this is how you find elements in your browser. This is how you read properties for an element. So let's say we have a form field. We can find it by ID, as we talked about earlier, or some kind of CSS selector or whatever you prefer to use. And then we can check, okay, let's check the attribute called placeholder to make sure the placeholder is set to whatever. The cool thing about this is, again, comparing it to like a scraping solution, the browser will execute JavaScript. So if you set the placeholder dynamically with JavaScript or something like that, this can still verify it. So then we can call assert equals on the attribute placeholder to make sure the placeholder equals like name or whatever it needs to be equal. The last, not the last, but almost the last thing is how do we interact with elements? Because the things you usually want to test in the front end is something about filling out forms, like signing up on a website, and we fill out the first name and last name of the email, we did not fill out the password, then you need to make sure that the validation error shows up, and like all those mundane things. We can also be like testing that the forgot password functionality and stuff like that works. So click and clear is something you'll often use with either form fields or click, you can use that for links, buttons, and stuff like that too. So you can do the whole navigation process. And the last thing, this is also kind of useful, especially to fill out form fields, keys. This will just simulate key presence on the keyboard. So you can just fill out a form field or do whatever you want there. And again, everything here works for JavaScript. So if you have like an Angular app or something that's really JavaScript heavy, you can still test it. It's not a problem at all. So let's go to a demo first. So I have a little SaaS app that we built in-house to Engage called Proximity. I think I used this as an example for the last talk too. But it's a great example of like a fairly large code base and something that works. So the first thing I want to show you is just a simple test case. In this case, we're basically just gonna check the title of the web page, so like the title tag. The way we do this is, first of all, I did complicate it a little bit further, but you'll see why in a sec, because we actually have a parent class here. And the parent class has something in the setup function that's kind of interesting. So the first thing you do when you start using Selenium is you have to tell it what browser to use, And you also have to set the general browser URL you want to start out with. Then if you go back to the simple test, we have a single function in a test case. This one will actually load that URL, and then we'll run a simple assert equals on these two parameters. So we'll check that this title returns Goldie familiar. These two items have to be equal, else the test will fail. So because we're using PHPUnit Selenium, the official Selenium PHPUnit library, we can call this to access all the functions that are built in Selenium. The other reason why this works is because if you look even further in the tree here, we have simple tests, the parent of simple test, regression test case, as I just showed you, and what we're actually studying in the end here is Selenium 2 test case. So that's why we can call this, title this, this, and all the other functions I just showed here. This by class name, this by CSS selector, this keys and stuff like that. Those are all similar. So let's try to run this simple test case first. So I'm going to go out to my terminal, and I think I'm going to make the text a little bit larger here, a little bit bigger here too. So all I need to do in order to run these tests is I need to make sure that Selenium is running. And all Selenium is a Java app. So essentially you run java-jar and then that jar file. So it's like running any Java app. There's a lot of information about how this works on the official Selenium documentation, so I don't want to dig too far into that. But essentially, you just run it, and it's kind of like a server. It's also called a Selenium server. This will hook into Firefox or Chrome, whatever the browser you need, and just make sure everything's working together. I already installed the Chrome WebDriver. There's also instructions on how to do that on the official documentation. But all you do is download another jar file and make sure it's in your path, in your path environment variable. All right, so now I can go up to my project and I can run PHPUnit as I would do normally. Right now, I'm just going to use the filter parameter to only run this test. So there's nothing fancy going on here. I'm just only going to run the simple test right now. So let's see if we can. Okay, so this is really fast. So you might not have even seen what's going on here. But all this does, you can see here the test passed first of all. But all this does is open the Chrome web browser and read the title tag. And now that it says OK, that means that our assertion was true and everything's good. Okay, so this is the base of how it works. So I want to go ahead and show you a more advanced example. So for example, I was just saying we often need to validate forms. In this case, what I'm interested in validating is a petition form. So I'm going to show it really quick, just so you have an idea of what we're testing. It is goldie.use proximity local. Just testing my local machine right now. That's really slow. But essentially, we have a simple sign form here, the name, email address, whatever, pretty default stuff. And we want to make sure that if you don't fill out all the fields, you'll see a validation error. So here's an example of how to accomplish that. So I'm just going to run through it really quick. Just stop me if any specific questions, but I'm not going to talk about this for half an hour because it'll probably bore you guys. But essentially, what we're doing is first we select the field with ID name, click it so it's focused, and then we simulate some key presses. So we fill out name field. And then we're going to submit the form. So here is something that's a little bit more complicated, but super, super useful, especially when you're dealing with Ajax-driven stuff, or stuff that's like dynamic. So I click on the submit button, and what I'm expecting now is the validation to fail. So first of all, I'm gonna make sure that the loading indicator is shown. So you just have to open it here. Basically, when you submit a form, there's a little loading indicator on here. See that? And I'm gonna wait until the loading indicator turns to a check mark, which is the default icon. So basically, right here, we're just waiting for the ADIS request to complete. And then down here, we can use the assert contains, assert not contains, which is the opposite, of course, to make sure that the zip code and email should have the has error class. That's kind of how the front end works. Is if there's an error, it'll put the has error class on it, and it'll be red background, all stuff. So let's try to run that test as well, just really quick. And this was the validate test, I believe it's called validation test. This is what it looks like. Again, it's going to be really quick. We're going to see if you look really closely, you can see the red outline. And so in this case, the test actually fails, so probably there's something wrong. That's also a good example of what happens when the test doesn't work. Timed out. Let's try one more time. It might be my wait until function that's not working correctly. Yeah. So I think what's going on is actually that this needs to return false. So the cool thing about the wait until function is it basically just uses polling. It'll keep calling this closure until it returns true. Alright, and now the test begins.
When the test failed, where did you see that it, or what had failed?
So in this case, it says it's timed out, which is kind of an odd error, but I had an idea of what was going on. The wait until function is a little bit tricky, a little bit weird, because it's not something that's Selenium specific, it's actually something that's more like PHPUnit specific. And yeah, all it does is it loops over and over again until the condition is met. But there's like different ways of using the function. One thing is just waiting for an element to be visible or shown. Another use case is waiting for something to be filled out or whatever. But it's very useful to wait for AJAX requests to complete, for example, because you don't know how long it will take. Another similar way of doing this will just be sleep for 10 seconds and then try to see what happens. But it's not as good of an approach. The last thing I want to show, see, up until now, the things you're doing here, you can totally do that using the regular unit testing functionality built into PHP with the Symfony scraping rip-crawl component. You can totally do all this. There's no reason, almost no reason to use use a browser, except for this part where we have some JavaScript and stuff going on. We want to test that specifically. The last thing I want to show is like a more advanced use case here. Where we actually have Facebook Connect working. So there's a little autofill with Facebook button over here. And you click that, it will ask you on Facebook if you want to connect with the app, and you have to click yes and stuff like that. So this example will, first of all, in the parent class, we have a little function that creates a Facebook account using the test API. This has really nothing to do with how Selenium works, but essentially all you can think it does is it gets a username and a password from Facebook, so you can set that up. And then what we do down here is we deal with page navigation. We click the confirm, I do want to connect with this app and stuff like that. And then at the very end, we basically just check that the name and email has been autofilled. So let's see if this works. Autofill tests. And again, this will be pretty fast, so you have to look closely. There is ways to slow it down, but just adding sleep functions here and there, but no hands.
Nice.
This is one of the places where Selenium really shines, especially when you use it like PHP and can like connect, like hook in and get like those test accounts on Facebook and stuff like that. So let's wait and see. And be good. So let's see if the test passed. Hopefully it did. Yeah. So again, this is just an example of different use cases for Selenium. So
is there a way in there to listen for like JavaScript events? Like maybe you have an AJAX process going that doesn't change the UI. Is there a way to listen?
Yeah. So this is a great question. How to listen for JavaScript events? So the wait until function is pretty flexible, and you can do a lot of things. you just need to find out a way for Selenium to detect a change. You can actually use Selenium to hook directly into JavaScript if you need to. After all, it's what you're using under the hood. It's using JavaScript to click on the button and stuff like that. So the way down to the function, you just replace the body with something that will hook into JavaScript and check if the condition is true or whatever you're looking for. Yeah.
Technically, you can probably inject JavaScript with Selenium into the browser.
Yeah.
Which do.
Yes.
Wait for that to call back or something.
Yeah, if you need to do something that's like fairly complicated or really want to test something deeper than the JavaScript, that's a good way to do it. Of course, you can also do just JavaScript unit testing, which is a whole totally different thing. So there's so many options for testing, so you need to figure out what makes more sense. You probably want to pick a couple of different types of testing. Like, I wouldn't just use Selenium for like an app if you are really good testing. You should do unit testing too, and probably some actual unit testing for JavaScript and stuff like that. So.
Regression tests is usually for front end.
Yeah, this is type of testing, yeah, absolutely. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the concept of regression testing is making sure that if you change something, stuff doesn't break, other stuff doesn't break, other stuff isn't affected. So in the end, I kind of want to talk about how you can take it further. So one thing I was briefly mentioning in the beginning was you can test multiple browsers. So this is, there's probably not a lot of situations where this is, where you will have things that work differently in different browsers, but you could definitely be interested in testing like, oh, does it work in like IE 8, 9, or whatever on Windows, versus how it works in Chrome and Mac. You might see some interesting differences. We're not really testing the layout here. We're not really testing if things are written correctly, even though Selenium can take screenshots for you. That's also an interesting thing. But it'll be very useful, for example, sometimes if you use vanilla JavaScript, if you use like native JavaScript, to hook into like public browser events. Internet Explorer will definitely behave different from WebKit, and even Firefox with the Gecko engine or whatever it's called will work different from Chrome. So that'll be super interesting to make sure that your stuff is working correctly across browsers. Selenium Grid is basically a way of installing Selenium on a server somewhere, so you can you open the browser on your server somewhere instead of your local computer. And you can actually tie that into some sort of continuous integration too. There's a couple of services that allows you to basically host Selenium Grid for you or something similar. For example, BrowserStack or Appium. So you can hook into, for example, here we use BrowserStack, and you can use BrowserStack to host all your browsers. And if you tie it into continuous integration using Jenkins or Travis or Circle CI or something like that, you can say, okay, every time we push to a certain branch or before we merge into master and pull requests and stuff like that, run all our regression tests with Selenium on this server out here, and make sure that all the tests passes. So you don't have to like, send it off on your local machine.
You can hook up BrowserStack with Circle and Selenium.
Yeah, as far as I understand, I haven't used it in practice myself, full disclosure, but that's kind of how it works. And BrowserStack kind of just works as an API. It's kind of like connecting to a regular Selenium server, which is super cool. And that compared with the fact that like a service like BrowserStack or Appium supports a ton of different browsers, I think you will even be able to use mobile browsers like Android, iPhone, and stuff like that. And it's a really interesting way of like testing things on the front end. Like you will normally, testing a website across all these different browsers, especially some complex flows, where you have to fill out forms and go through multiple steps. You can't do that manually. You can't just use like a screenshot service to like take a screenshot of how it renders in the browser. It's just not good enough. So based on all of this, anything specific you have questions about?
So it's tightly coupled though to your design. Like he was talking about, not putting IDs on things, or I changed the class of this, or
Yeah,
change
absolutely.
the content of that.
It uses your DOM. Like you have to use CSS selectors or IDs or whatever to target the right elements. So it definitely uses your whole DOM. And it's a lot like the web crawler functionality built into Laravel, the template component to use. The big difference is it's in the browser rather than crawled.
Just seems like something when you're smaller, if I'm working on the design and the tests,
Mhm.
it's fine. But if I'm working on the design and somebody else is doing the tests and I tweak the design a little bit, I don't tell the test guy kind of thing.
Yeah, then the test will break. But you can say that that's kind of how a lot of testing works in general. Except for the fact, of course, when you're writing like general unit tests, the person buying the tests is a developer, and the person like a backend person-ish, and the person writing the code is also a backend developer, so it's kind of the same thing. But if you have your, let's say, a front-end developer who's not related to Selenium, or at least not writing PHP and working this way, yes, there might be some miscommunication there, and they can like change the CSS class or whatever and break there. But the cool thing is, it should be pretty easy to fix. If you suddenly see an error here, it'll say, okay, the CSS class doesn't exist. So you'll be like, oh, okay, let me talk to whoever did that and see what happened. Hopefully the installation should be pretty straightforward.
Do you guys use that here? Do you end up using Selenium?
Yeah, so one example is, of course, proximity. I use it for. We had a bug where you click autofill Facebook and you like refresh your browser one extra time before it actually autofilled it. So I kind of like took a little like almost like TDD approach, wrote the test first, and then fixed the bug afterwards. And now, the reason why this bug was introduced was because some other code was changed and broke this. So now, for the future, it can never break again without us knowing as soon as we run the unit test, of course. The first time I started using this was actually for a very front-end heavy web app. We had this like complex sign-up flow with like 3 or 4 different steps. You had to like upload an image and like connect with Facebook optionally, pick something on a map, and like there's different things to do. And we had the problem that JavaScript was getting kind of messy. We wanted to refactor it, and like we can't refactor it because we're going to break everything. So like, okay, let's write a Selenium test and make sure everything passes, and then start messing with JavaScript. And in the end, if Selenium passes again, and we also do like a manual test on top of that, of course, we can't just run 100% of the machine. So if you take the Selenium test, compare it with a manual test walkthrough, you're pretty good. You've managed to refactor the whole JavaScript without having anybody yell at you. So, pretty awesome. But it's not for every project. You have to decide if this is something for you, if it's something you think will be beneficial.
The wait until, can you set a timeout with that?
Yeah, so in one example, I think it's a Facebook one actually, I do have a timer here. So if it takes more than 30 seconds for this form to be filled out, I'll take it as a fail. I think it just throws an exception, and PHPUnit will, if an exception is not expected, PHPUnit will be like, okay, test fail. So.
Are you using Atom?
No, it's actually Sublime Text.
Oh,
It's a fancy theme.
oh.
So, I'm really considering actually looking into PHP Storm. I didn't know Marcus is a huge fan of it.
Yeah, I was using Atom until about a week ago, and then I switched over to PHP Storm, and I might not be able to go back.
I use PHP Storm for a side project on my PC at home.